Thank you very much. Actually, if you get a chance, if you ever want to see exactly what his office was like, you can go to Liverpool, to the museum, and actually see the recreation of his exact writing space, which his son has built in the library, right down to a nice, well, a 1970s ashtray of the old sort that you can push a button down and it spins and fins open up and the ashes go underneath and then it closes again. And if you're lucky enough to be there with Tom, his son, Tom will let you actually play with the ashtray and pick things up and look around the room. But it's really easy. He built it, and it's actually got something that I think all writers would love to have. It has two doors. The outside door, they're just wooden panel doors. One opens out, the other opens in. And the rule in the house when Tom Jr. was growing up was that if the outside door was closed, both doors were closed, you couldn't bother him for anything. If the doors were open, you could go in. If one door was closed, you could go in if there was an emergency. And they used to have a discussion in the house. If the outside door was closed and the house was on fire, could you go and tell Dad that the house was on fire? And they decided that you couldn't, because the rule was if that door was closed as well, you could not bother him working. And I mean, Riddell himself is, I mean, an astounding writer, and I mean, his autobiography is, I mean, he decided to be a writer. He decided he would take no support of any kind except what he could sell his books and stories and work for. No grants, no financial assistance of any kind, and there are precious few writers in Canada who can do that and make a living at it, which he did very well. So it's I mean, he's a fascinating writer, and of course, one because I grew up in Halifax that I, as a young man, hated him because I had to read Warden of the North. Halifax, Warden of the North for either history or English. I don't remember which one, but it was big. And so, yes, and that's the measure, the sort of a measure of what not to like about it. I'm going to indulge myself. I'm going to read a story from Whirl Away, but I'm going to read the whole story, which is something I hardly ever get to do. I had actually decided to read one thing, but then Gary and Jeanette showed up, and they run a festival in Cape Breton, and what I was going to read, they've already heard. Now, one of the benefits of short stories is you can jump around, and eventually, if you're lucky, you can read the entire book, one place or another. And my first book, I actually read everything, and called it. At that point, it was the first book I'd ever written, and I was sort of, when I was on tour with it, what I would do is in any town there was a literary magazine that had rejected one of the stories, I'd read that one there. But I managed to get through and finish up in Winnipeg, and afterwards, actually the editor of Prairie Fire was there, and he came up and he said, I don't remember rejecting that story. I said, well, you did. I have a bookmark here, which is your rejected note. But I'm not bitter. This story's called Echo. And it's a book that's really interested in point of view, and this is from the point of view of a 5-year-old. A 5-year-old who's a little different. Kevin Rowe was on the front deck, hemmed in behind the fence pickets, looking down on the narrow street. He was 5 years old, and he had serious, obvious eyes with small, square eyeglasses. Behind the glasses, emotions played across his face quickly, like a traveling storm. His eyebrows rose at the faintest hint of confusion, furrowing his forehead, and fell again quickly, leaving behind a blank, smooth slate that never seemed to have borne a mark. He had short hair, all of it cut the same length, so that it stood up like bristles on a brush. Kevin was just tall enough that his eyes were above the level of the deck railing, sharp blue eyes that didn't seem to blink often enough. He stared, unabashed, at passing cars, at walking people, and he talked in short, tight bursts of words. Don't you care what I think? He said over the edge of the railing, the movement of his lips barely visible, but his mouth enunciating every word. Don't you even care what I think? The railing topped the brown fence that ran all around the deck and all around the front of the small bungalow. It was a white house, vinyl siding, single story with light blue trim, occasional brush strokes of blue lipping onto the white like feathers. All of the windows of the small dark bedrooms at the front of the house were open, doing their best to shed the heat. It was uncomfortably hot for St. John's, the air thick and heavy and motionless, all over damp, like the insides of Kevin's father's work gloves when he'd taken them off for a rest and Kevin had slid one of his own hands inside. Kevin's parents were in the kitchen at the back, his father sitting down at the table with his work shirt off, his undershirt going yellow, his mother doing dishes in the steel sink. Kevin didn't like the sound of the dishes, the way the plates and cutlery rattled and scraped against the metal. Before he went out, he'd brought his bowl over to the sink the way he was supposed to, a scant handful of cereal O's swimming like life rings in the leftover milk. The handle of the spoon slid back and forth along the edge of the bowl with every step. Then his mother told Kevin to go out on the deck. His father was looking down at his feet as if he was surprised they were still in the same place. Kevin's father drove from St. John's to Boston and back, big rigs with chrome wheels, and every time he came home, Kevin would come into the living room and be startled to find his father in front of the television or hear his father in the bedroom snoring like he'd never really left. For Kevin, it was like going into the kitchen and finding there was an extra fridge where there hadn't been one before. It was a magic trick, as if his father could just simply appear again and again and again. By the time the surprise of it wore off, Kevin's father would be ready to head back out on the road, hauling fish to Boston and furniture back again. Kevin's mother held the door open as he went out onto the deck, telling him not to get into trouble. "Stay on the deck and stay off the road," she said, and as she did, a car whooshed by next to the deck. Like an example, she'd whipped up just for him. "Stay off the road," she said again, and she put all the emphasis on off. Kevin heard the door latch behind her, the click sharp and final. Kevin's father hadn't said anything when Kevin was in the kitchen, but a few moments later, Kevin heard the deep rumble of his voice from the kitchen, not so much words as a deep straight line, all one note. And over the top of it, his mother's thin voice, growing higher and then falling away, like a ball bouncing up and down, up and down. It was like they were singing together, each one already sure where the other one was going and just exactly where they would eventually end up. It was hot in the sun, Kevin thought, and the water in the inflatable swimming pool on the deck was murky, catching struggling daddy longlegs and wandering, curious, paper-winged moths that lay flat on the surface at the mercy of potential rescuers. It was too late for several toys, completely submerged and fuzzed with small air bubbles. Kevin fished the toys out. A green rubber frog that sprayed water out through a small hole in its mouth, a plastic power shovel, the hard yellow wand from a bottle of bubble liquid, making sure he kept the dripping water away from his t-shirt and shorts, and then he threw them back in again, watching them sink back down to the blue vinyl bottom of the pool. After he threw them back in, they lay still on the bottom. Above them, the ripples on the surface made them appear to wriggle for a few moments before the water fell still. The bottom of the pool had lines, where the weight of the water had pulled the plastic down into the cracks between the boards. "There you go again," Kevin said to the surface of the water. "There you go again. How many times do I have to listen to this stuff?" He turned, and out on the road he saw a man with a dog on a leash. The dog was brown and white, a heavy, low-slung beagle with big, sad, bloodshot eyes and dragging ears. Kevin thought the dog and the man looked a lot alike, and he watched them through the slatted pickets as they made their way along the road. He pressed himself down onto the surface of the deck, trying to make himself inconspicuous, creeping on his stomach, so he stayed even with the dog's slow, plodding walk. The street ran in tight to the front of the deck, so Kevin could look through the railing and see the mottled color of the side of the man's face, dappled with small, shiny beads of sweat. The man looked angry, Kevin thought, even though there was nothing to be angry about. Suddenly, there were seeds from dandelions parachuting in on the wind under their silver-white canopies, regiments of soldiers landing all around him, and Kevin was the only one left to protect the base, the only survivor. "Bang," he said, pointing a loaded index finger at the air. The dog looked around at the sound and stopped walking. But the man kept going, pulling the leash hard. The dog appeared startled when the collar suddenly dug into its neck. "Save it for someone who cares," Kevin said to the dog. "Save it for someone who cares." The dog didn't look back. Across the street, Mrs. Batten came around the corner of her house from the backyard and started to rake the grass. Rake, rake, stop. Rake, rake, stop. During one of the stops, she looked across, spotted Kevin, and waved. But Kevin wasn't sure whose army she was with, whether she knew the password or not, so he kept very still and looked up under the edge of the railing, watching for airplanes. Everyone has to watch for the planes. It was like that in every movie. Sometimes airplanes draw lines with clouds, Kevin thought, like arrows that show you right where they are, and sometimes they make a noise that makes you think they're actually somewhere else, not where they are. Then he saw there was a spider in the corner of the deck, a brown, fat spider with a white pattern on its backside. The spider was finishing a small and perfect web onto the top edge of the deck railing, the tips of its front legs plucking at the sticky lines, placing the threads. Kevin pointed at the spider and shook his finger. You don't really want to fix things, do you? You don't even really want to try. The spider continued picking at the sticky webbing, working its way around the outside circle of the web, Kevin's words passing right through it. He sat down on the deck and watched the spider, pushing his glasses back up his nose every time they slid down. It was getting hotter on the deck, and he was starting to sweat. Mrs. Batten finished raking and walked back behind her house, and Kevin purposely watched her out of the corner of his eye. Still, neither of his parents came to Kevin's front door. He thought they should, that someone should check to see how he was doing. The door was closed tight, like it was sealed into place. There were grown-up voices in the distance behind it, rumbling like a thunderstorm far away. By then, the sun was high, and Kevin thought he would like a sandwich and some juice. He would like a tuna fish sandwich on white bread cut into triangles so he could eat in from the points towards the crusts and then leave the crusts behind on his plate. It would be even better if the bread was soft and fresh so he could flatten it into bread balls with his tongue against the roof of his mouth. And all the tuna, every scrap in the whole sandwich, would be light and pinkish and salty, with no fishy-tasting dark bits that pop up sometimes and wreck a whole sandwich. Kevin thought he'd like a glass of apple juice, poured fast so the bubbles stayed in place in a ring around the inside of the glass, but there was no sandwich and no apple juice. Kevin watched the spider and wondered if it would catch a fly and eat it. The web didn't look strong enough to hold anything, even if a fly accidentally flew into the trap. You'd like that, wouldn't you? Kevin said sharply. You'll go along with anything as long as we're doing it your way. Then there was the sharp sound of glass breaking inside the house, and from the front window, loud voices that got louder every time the wind from the back of the house puffed the curtains out against the window screens. Now and then, Kevin could hear snatches of words, sometimes his mother, her voice low and hard and biting off the end of every word, his father's a steady grumble that sometimes erupted into single words like job and paid, once a sound like someone smacking their hand flat down on the smooth surface of the countertop. Then crying that sounded far away to Kevin, like he was hearing it through a cardboard tube from a roll of paper towels. The sound kept rolling from the house, like waves slapping in on the shore. Kevin remembered the dog on the leash and wished he had a dog. It wouldn't have to be a big dog, he thought, just a friendly little dog with black eyes and a wet nose, the kind of dog that would drink water from the swimming pool and then look out through the fence with him. They could explore the back of the house and the bottom of the sharp cliff, and all the time the dog would be busy with its nose, head down and curious. Kevin thought he would let the dog sleep in his room, up on the foot of his bed if it wanted, and if there was ever a fire or burglars, the dog would wake up and lift its head and growl deep in his throat as a warning. After the first time the dog warned them about something dangerous, his parents would let the dog sleep anywhere it wanted. After a while, Kevin found the last part of the deck where there was still a long blue triangle of shade, and he fell asleep on the boards watching a line of ants march around the corner of the house and down the siding to the ground. Just before he slept, Kevin was thinking about what kind of name his dog would have. When he woke up, the sun had toppled over the cliff behind the house, and the whole deck was in shadows. It was colder, and there was a blue and white police car parked on the road, the lights on its roof flashing and throwing the shadows of the fence palings across him and all around the front of the house. A policeman got out of the car and closed the door. Then he walked up to the deck, reached over the top of the gate so he could open the latch from the inside. He looked at Kevin and put one finger in front of his lips, but he didn't say anything. Kevin nodded back, and he thought the policeman smiled, but he wasn't sure. The policeman's face was pulled tight. Kevin sat up, resting his back against the fence, and watched as the policeman reached a hand for the doorknob and turned it without even knocking. The policeman's other hand was on the top of the gun in his holster. Kevin could see the black butt end of the gun, its plastic handle patterned and rough. That's so you can get a good grip on it, he thought, so you can hold on tight when you shoot. I think I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Should we let him stop there?
Do you want to hear how it ends?
Should we close?
Let me have a look.
Feels like something bad.
Oh, could something bad happen as one of my stories? No way. Never. I'll tell.
Dog is the road.
The policeman held onto his gun, although he didn't take it out of the holster, and with his other hand he pushed the door open and he went in, the door angling closed behind him. Kevin stood up, looked across the street, and saw Mrs. Batten looking out through the front window of her house, but she only stayed there for a second. All along the street, Kevin saw people in their doorways as if they were listening to some distant sound, like a mysterious, silent dog whistle. He saw the way the neighbors were all tilting their heads, all turning a little bit the same way. He saw the Barretts and even Mrs. Connaught, who sometimes brought warm cookies over to his house on a big, colorful plate with a rooster on it. Kevin thought he would like a cookie now. Another police car arrived, then another, a second policeman, then a third. The second policeman went into the house. The third one took Kevin's hand in his and pulled him in tight alongside the house. "We'll just wait right here," the policeman said. He had short blonde hair, and he sounded almost scared. "Nothing else on my dance card," Kevin said, his voice low and gruff. "Maybe you should just sit down and shut up for once." The policeman looked at him, and then towards the noises coming out of the house, but he didn't let go of Kevin's hand. Soon, Kevin heard the rise and fall of a siren getting closer and closer. By the time the ambulance swung wide around the narrow corner, all its lights were flashing, and it was taking up more than its own lane. There were people in almost every door along Fahey Street, and Mrs. Batten was standing on the lawn with both hands up in front of her mouth. Kevin watched very carefully, without speaking or blinking, watched as his father performed his disappearing act all over again, this time with his arms tight behind his back as if he were hiding something. The first policeman was holding on to his shoulder, as if he was trying to help him keep his balance. There were more policemen now, and there was a van. Inside the house, someone was taking photographs. Kevin could see the white flash from the camera bouncing off the walls. He was thinking about tuna fish again. And then he thought that the ambulance attendants should be bringing out the long white stretcher, and his mother would be reaching out from under the sheet and holding his hand for a moment before they took her through the gate to the ambulance. "Be a good boy." That's what she'd say, he decided. "Be a good boy and do what they tell you." Kevin was sure he would start to cry. But his mother didn't come out, and the ambulance lights kept flashing. The back doors opened so he could see inside. Behind the police cars, a blue car with a serious-looking woman behind the steering wheel pulled up next to the fence. Kevin watched the car sitting at the curb. "I'm Mrs. Thornhill," the woman said to Kevin after she climbed heavily up onto the deck next to him, "but you can call me Bo." Bo had a folded gray blanket in her hands, and she unfolded it and put it over Kevin's shoulders. It was rough on his skin, and he shrugged it off the first time. But she put it back over him and led him to the car, where she put him in the back seat and fastened the seatbelt. "There you go, dear," she said. Kevin didn't say anything. Then she got in the front seat of the car and pulled her own seatbelt across herself with a long, slow movement that looked difficult. It took a few tries before the tongue of the belt clicked into place. Then Bo Thornhill said, "We're going to go for a ride. Here we go." Kevin watched out the window, watched the way the pickets on the deck seemed to jump when the car started moving. He squinted his eyes, making the edges of the pickets go faster and faster. "Don't you care what I think?" he said to the smooth glass of the closed window as the lights started to hurry by, faster when his street joined a larger street and the car sped up. He watched his breath fog on the inside of the glass when he said the words. "Don't you even care?" The inside of the car was still. When he listened carefully, it sounded like Bo Thornhill was humming quietly. After a moment, Kevin said, "Just like your mother." Up above, he watched the flashing lights of a single airplane fingering the fading sky. The sound of its engines hadn't caught up yet, he thought, because it was still stretched out behind it across the air. Oh, you're welcome. And that's going to be a movie, strangely enough, because Nance Ackerman who's a Nova Scotia filmmaker, is in the process of getting the rights to that. And she actually sent me a draft script, and it's kind of cool, some of the things that she's going to do. It's going to be a short film, so yeah. Yeah.
What kind of time frame is that?
I don't know. Well, it'll be a relatively short one. Actually, there's the 4 other stories in the book have also been optioned by Jason Buxton, who did Blackbird, for a feature film. So, that's a longer process. I think Nance can probably have it put together by next fall, if everything goes smoothly. So, yeah.
Is that the first time that's happened?
Oh yes, yeah. I'm pretty excited about that. Yeah. Oh, and the firefighting book is a memoir, actually, but it is in that strange land of creative nonfiction. And I mean, the way I take creative nonfiction is you get to use the same devices you would use in fiction, and you can play with time, but everything has to have happened. So, and in a memoir, everything has to happen. The only difficulty with it is it's a memoir that I wrote. I was a firefighter for 6.5 years, chunk of time in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, when I was in university and just after, and for 4.5, 5 years in Portugal Cove, St. Philip's, which is outside St. John's. And it was interesting and always different, but it was not quite what I expected, because I thought I'd be fighting fires. I didn't think I'd be doing medical calls and car accidents and cutting people out of cars. And I started when I was 18, and I was my dad was an oceanographer, my mom was a marine biologist. All of their relatives were south of the border. I'd never seen a dead body ever. Meat came in packages at the store, and then about 3 weeks after I was fighting fires in Wolfville, I was at car accidents where people were all torn up. So it was, it was startling and jarring, and ended up doing a lot more damage than you would think possible. And yet I kept doing it for years and years and years. So, and only occasionally get nightmares now. But
So when that book came out, you were interviewed on Information Money by Don Connolly. And I remember waking up to you describing your experiences. And it was such an amazing interview to listen to. What are your impressions of being interviewed about that time in your life? It's very difficult.
it all depends on I've gotten much better about it as I've gotten some distance between the book and the whole firefighting life. But I was on Sunday Edition one morning, and Michael Enright was sitting across from me, and he said, "Don't worry." He said, "I won't ask you." This is before we started. He said, "I won't ask you about the sex stuff, because there is a syndrome in emergency workers. It's called, and it's it's from the Red Cross on down, firefighters, police. It's called rescue sex, and what it involves is usually if you're, if you're jarred out of your regular life, and then you go to something particularly horrible, when you come back to your warm house and everything is, anyway, it's an awful experience, because you're pretty cold and distant, but you want to be absolutely certain you're alive. He said, "I want to ask you about that." So that was the first question he asked as soon as the tape was rolling. So some.
Why did I agree to do this?
Some interviews are worse than others. He was a bit of a surprise, but no, I didn't. One of the problems with that situation was when I was actually doing interviews with that. I wrote the book because I thought it would shed a whole bunch of stuff, let me sort of box it up and get rid of it. But it brought it all back. And, I didn't realize I was in trouble until I started having something called, so I started experiencing fugues. At my office, I was an assignment editor at the newspaper, and I had the fire department scanner next to me for all of the fire departments on the Northeast Avalon in Newfoundland, and they would say where they were going, and what they were going to. There's, there'd be a whole bunch of different codes. But if they said, we're going to an MVP, an MVAP, he was a motorcycle or a motor vehicle accident pedestrian, and an MVAM is one with a motorcycle, and those are the two that are almost always serious, because all of these smaller departments operate with highways, not with streets. And I would just blink out. I would go to a scene I'd been at in Wolfville, and I would be gone from work until, and it is absolutely realistic. It is absolutely as if you were experiencing something all over again. You have no control to step out of it. And then you begin, then you start having experiences like I would drive to the grocery store and end up somewhere and not know how I got there. So I thought then it would probably be a good idea to start getting professional help, and that worked out. That worked out pretty well, because it's something that that should be said about all mental illness. Really, is that I went to the person I went to. She sat me down. She said, "Okay," she says, "I know pretty much where you are." She said, "You picture your brain as a leg. You've broken your leg." She said, "In 4 months the cast will be off. Another couple of months down the road, you'll be in physio. You'll be getting some training on how to strengthen muscles again. And a year down the road, if everything should be reasonable, you'll still have pain on rainy days. You'll still be aware of it, but it will be fundamentally." And I thought, wow, it's an injury. It's just like any, I broke ribs in my nose playing rugby. It's just like that. And it was somehow, then I actually was able to talk about it more. But having written it all down and promised to the publisher and been paid for it in advance, then I had to actually finish it and send it out. And, it's way more personal than I had ever expected it would be. And, and every now and then I still run into firefighters who are on the same scene, and they tend to just sort of step up to you sideways when you're not expecting it, send you emails, and so it didn't have exactly the desired result, but it's stuff is smoothed over. That came out in 2008, so I've had 5 years to settle into it, but But I mean, the whole radio interview experience is so strange, because you can go to an interview where they've read the whole book and they know the whole thing, or you can go in. I was on a call-in program where the guy put a cart in the machine for a 30-second car advertisement for a dealership, and he said, "All I've read is the back of the book. You got 30 seconds. What's it about?" So it can vary, But luckily, actually, that was the only time I've ever actually traveled with a publicist. And this was a woman who used to run a bookstore here in town, Mojo, Mary Jo Anderson. And she was kind of Mrs. Doubtfire-esque, but not because of her appearance, but because she had this massive purse. And you would go to an event or something, you come out and I'd be shaking. And she'd go, "Would you like some water? Or a bottle of juice? Would you like an apple, an orange? I have some nuts. Would you like a chocolate bar?" And she had this stock that she carried around, just in case the author got in trouble. You can at least load up your blood sugar, or make sure you didn't, dry out completely. So, yeah, I think she's out. At last I talked to her, she was out in Banff working at the writers program up there. So.
Before we started, Russell asked if there's going to be a question and answer, and I guess the answer is yes. So, any other questions for Russell?
Yeah. I used to. I was out at a festival in BC, and I stayed at. Andreas Schroeder is a guy who used to run the Writers' Union of Canada, and came up with a great concept, the public lending rights payment. And he was at the head of the TWC when that actually got through. So, and once a year, I get a couple of pints of beer on Andreas. But he was getting ready for a question and answer period at this festival. And I had been staying in he had a little cottage on the beach. He said, "You want to stay there?" And I said, "Okay," rather than in a hotel somewhere. And he said, we were going out to his event, and he came at me, gave me this piece of paper. I said, "What's this, Andres?" He said, "It's payment for the cottage." I said, "Payment for the cottage?" I said, "You're paying me?" He said, "No." He said, "There's question and answers in my thing. If no one asks a question, those are your questions that you were going to ask." and I got one out, and then, it sort of started things up, but.
So it's short stories that are going to be into what length film?
Yep, 4 of them. There's, if it wasn't for Gary and Jeanette, you would have heard a piece of something called Family Law. No, you would have heard the other one, Open Arms, which are two stories about a man and a woman in an adulterous relationship. One from the man's point of view, and one from the woman's. I was going to read Mary, which is hard to read because you have to keep convincing people that you're named Mary when you have a goatee. And they're going to take those 2 and a story called 911, which is about an ambulance driver who's on suspension and steals an ambulance because there are no ambulances it's in the Annapolis Valley. There's no ambulances available in Berwick, Canfield, Wolfville, New Minas, Port Williams, Canning. It's just he can hear them going out looking for ambulances. So he steals an ambulance to go to a heart attack and wrecks it. And the other story they're using is one called Sharp Corner, which is about a guy who has nothing to do with emergency services whatsoever, but lives on a sharp corner on a rural road, and cars keep crashing on his front lawn. So he becomes a sort of he thinks, an expert storyteller about, he talks about these stories in great detail until finally his wife basically loses her mind, because he starts doing research on what these accidents look like and how they occur. And he says, there's yaw in the tire marks. And she goes, you stood in the front window and a car crashed on the lawn. This is enough. I don't want to go to parties with you anymore. I don't want to go to barbecues with you. And so he's going to knit those 4 together. I'm not really sure how yet, but yeah.
You don't have any role in that?
I was asked if I wanted to take part in the screenwriting, and I said, no, because I don't know how those 4 stories would fit together, and I also don't know diddly about screenwriting, which is, it take, 54,000 words and turn it into 16,000 at the outset with all your blocking written in. It's remarkable how much less material is in it, so. But it's and I think he's working with a screenwriter from Vancouver, and I think short stories, novels, and nonfiction's probably enough to keep me busy, rather. But
That's
so
so
in that creative process to go from short stories to the film, it'll actually go, for one of a better word, down in length rather than up in length.
Generally, when a novel becomes a movie, it gets shortened up tremendously. In this case, what will happen is they're going to take short stories and build it into a block of the 4 of them, and then knock it down again to make it work. And I'm not really sure. Like he's got some idea on how the 4 characters can coexist in the same storyline.
It's not just taking the gem of the idea and totally reworking it for something else.
No. In some way, the 4 of them are going to mesh together. Now, I can see how he can do it with the 2 family law people and with the ambulance driver and the sharp corner guy, but I don't really see how he's going to bring all those together unless the family law lawyer is also doing accidents, which he may do. I mean, he can change stuff around. Now, the stories are very, very much about family law, because they're huge archives of family law cases, and if you at all driven to do different things, like maybe read as many as you can, which I did for a while, there's all manner of amazing stories in family law archives. And a lot of one of the stories is about how family law works and how unsatisfying it is for everybody involved. So, except for the, and for the lawyer, because no one is ever really happy with their family law lawyer. So, but it is.
In your job at the archives, did you work on Department of Justice?
No, I worked in periodicals and newspapers, and I did the microfilm, checking the microfilm, and we're checking off every edition that you possibly have. So by the end of the evening, working microfilm, just going, joot, one, then you're car sick from watching, because it goes up and down and it jerks back and forth. I also did stuff in collections and help people, get things. I would fetch stuff. And I was also one of the guys who would bring in new collections if they were heavy. And there is some fascinating stuff in the archives that shouldn't be in the archives and is sealed for 25 years, which means I could talk about it now. Because I was when I was 19, 80? PANS, the Public Archives in Nova Scotia, yeah. Yeah, we took actually, I don't know. So a dentist left all of his records to the archives, like all of his billing records, everything. And we brought in all these filing cabinets. And he was a nitrous oxide dentist. He was a laughing gas dentist. And we had his gas equipment, tanks, and all this stuff, like why the archives would want it. But it was part of the collection, so they took the whole thing, and I suppose stuff gets dispersed afterwards. And he had all these filing cabinets, and none of them were locked except one. And one filing cabinet was locked, so we say, filing cabinet's locked. So they said, you can open the filing cabinet, you can unlock the filing cabinet, we'll find out what's in the locked filing cabinet. Because you're there, you're endlessly curious. Like there's boxes of stuff that have never been looked at, may never be looked at. And I was 20, so we opened it up, and it was a filing cabinet entirely full of bras. All different, all from different people. From his office.
So and the anesthesiologist that
So we always thought, we sort of thought that maybe, just maybe, they were just, it was a way of, sealing the evidence for 25 years. So I don't know if the collection is open now. No. But there were things in there, like you would go up, and there's a on the third floor, and one of the there's a steamer trunk. And I collected stamps when I was a kid, but there is a steamer trunk up there that's about this wide and about that high. And when you open it up, it's completely filled with mint condition stamps, British stamps, in stacks tied with white cotton thread. It's just a box of unused postage stamps. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And they're like cordwood. They're all stacked in tight to each other. Whole trunk full, And I mean, the archival value, I suppose, is nothing, but, it's a box, stamps, there you go, you're done. There's an address on the box. But the stamps themselves are quite valuable, I'm sure. So, yeah. So archives are great places for stories. But so are newspapers. So are fire departments. Airports, casinos. Casinos are great for stories because, everything is distilled down to only a couple of deadly sins. There's greed, obviously, but there's a lot of lust in casinos. Yeah, so it's always a story sort of percolating away. So, not very happy people.
So your next collection of short stories is going to tap into which one of these rich resources?
Well, there's a casino story in it. The next collection of short stories is actually done, but it won't be out till 2015 at the earliest because I have to finish a novel first. That's in third edit, but it's called Big Lies, and it's about big lies. But it actually, Gary will appreciate this. It deviates a bit. It actually has 4 happy stories. 4. There's only one happy story in this.
And 4 happy stories out of how many?
I think it's 16 in that one right now. Well, it's better than this. There's one. Well, that's a big improvement on percentage because, I mean, Whirl Away is what, 12 or 14, and there's one you could call happy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and there's one happy.
One happy.
And even that's not fully happy.
Is the novel happy or sad, and why does it have to be finished first?
I signed a contract. And the novel is not just sad. The novel is, whoa. The novel is, I don't know, it may never get published, even though they've paid for it. The novel is dark. It's about a guy. I got really interested in the idea of private information and how in the electronic age everyone talks about identity theft and all the rest of it. And I thought, well, there's been identity theft going on and theft of information for ages. This guy the book is called Walt, and it's about a guy named Walt. And he's a custodian in a grocery store, and he collects dropped grocery lists and then uses them to his own ends. And you think, well, what can you do? Well, you can read the grocery list and try and figure out something about the person who dropped it, or you can look at what they wrote it on. So I collected 450 now grocery notes that people have dropped in stores. Store managers in St. John's collected them for me. That people just drop on the floor, and I got one that's a really short one. It's chips, dip, diapers, 2 packages golden blonde hair dye, and it's just like a whole. It's like, I know who dropped this note. I can find them in the store, and Walt does find them, and he uses this information to his own ends, and he won't tell you who he is or anything other than to say that he's Walt. And his wife has disappeared. But
A few weeks ago, I was in Toronto, in the Whirl Away Museum, which sounds bizarre in this context. However, their key exhibit at the moment is Mesopotamia from the Whirl Away in London. And at one point, you go into it with the Popular Revolution writing, and they have a huge stack of books like that that they have collected from various places in Toronto, including giant tubes, to chronicle this, what writing can do for you, lists.
Oh, well, but I mean, lists. The thing about it is, grocery lists are the most magic of disposable lists. As soon as you're done, you do not need it. It is the ultimate bit of, tissue paper is worse, but you do not want it. But with a grocery list, when you filled the list, you're done. So you drop it. But I have them on mortgage statements, credit card bills. I have it on one of my favorites. I have about 6 of these. Federal NDP mailouts. The federal NDP will send you a mailout in an envelope. It's like addressed ad mail, which they send for free, but has the name of every single householder over the age of 19 on it. So if it's you, your wife, your daughter, full names for all 3 who live at that house are on the front of that envelope. And since it's like addressed ad mail, you take it, you write your list on the back, and then you pitch it, right? I have them on the backs of astounding things. I have names, I have email addresses and passwords written underneath them with a grocery list on the other side. It's just a huge collection of shed information because you're looking at the one side and forget the other side even exists. So you just, So I got it. Unfortunately, Walt ended up being way nastier than I thought he would be. And there's a story in here about traveling salesman who goes through Newfoundland I think he's selling energy drinks, and he picks up a hitchhiker. And then he lets this hitchhiker out because he can't find the cabin that she's looking for. And then he starts thinking, what happens if someone decides that I did something? What if she says that I did something? How will I prove I didn't do anything? If there might be DNA in the car now. So I'm going to get out of traveling salesman. And when I wrote the story, the ending's kind of ambiguous. He's so defensive. He says in the story, I didn't do anything. Okay, I didn't do. And if anyone says I didn't do it. And you're thinking, you're protesting an awful lot. So, but in my mind, he didn't do anything. So then I got thinking, what if he did? So I turned him into Walt in the book as well. So now Walt picks up a hitchhiker, and he's much less charming. He doesn't speak to himself in a Scottish accent the way the traveling salesman does, or tell funny stories, or anything. He's just Walt. Yeah, Walt's a bit. I'm having a hard time getting the book done. I don't like being in the same computer as Walt. Oh no, he's awful.
Sounds like someone that would give you nightmares.
Well, and the thing about it, and look, I covered, and this is the other, you get information from all kinds. I covered court when I was at CBC for 3 out of the 5 years I was there. And I was always blown away by the fact that you could go down to court and you'd have someone who was up on charges and had pleaded guilty and was there for sentencing, who had done something horrendous, like not only kicked a little old lady down the stairs, but robbed her of her pension money, and on and on and on. Horrible creature. And there'd be people in the front row crying because Jimmy's being put away, because they loved him. Members of his family loved him. And I thought, how can people, like, with all the, how do you put that together in your head? How do you justify still loving someone who has done something really horrible and has admitted it, and isn't even saying, well, I was found guilty, I'm innocent, but I was found guilty, and you shouldn't believe me. No, if someone's pleading guilty, and they're saying, yeah, I did it. And yet, there's still people weeping in the front row who are family members of the person who's going to jail. And there's a bit about, I also have this sort of idea that, you end up with a lot of people who are just walking around among you who operate on a completely different playbook. And that's what Walt does, is he operates on a completely different plane entirely. Yeah. So.
Something bad happens to Walt.
Well, in a way it does, sort of. But yeah, it's a novel, and I find novels very difficult. Short stories are much more fun. My editor was telling me when we're into the 3rd edit now. I said, why don't we just stop? I've got these short stories. I'll tell you what, I'll trade you. You stop working on Walt, and I'll stop working on Walt. We'll work on the short stories together, and we'll put them out in the fall. And she said, you know what? You know why you like short stories? And I said, why? She said, because you're lazy.
What do you think about all this commentary on Alice Munro and how they tried really hard to get her to write novels, and when she finally just said,
No.
no.
It's great. But she's the rarest thing in Canada is an author who makes a living from their books. But even more rare than that, the Honus Wagner baseball card of making money as an author is someone who makes a living as an author writing short stories. It's, hers sell tremendously well. A good strong short story collection in Canada right now sells about 2,100 copies. Right? If you're lucky enough to get on the Giller shortlist, you might sell 7,000. But a novel on the Giller shortlist will sell between 20 and 25,000 on the low side. So you can see why publishers are much more keen to have someone write a novel. And you get someone like Alice Munro, who not only captures a place so well in a short story, but captures it consistently throughout the whole collection. The idea that you could say, try and persuade her to, please just do, put these characters together in a longer form, and we'll all sell more books. You can see why but the problem is it's a completely different form. And the reason that short stories are so much fun to work on is you can hold the whole idea in your head. Like, I can be working on the computer, I can know the beginning, the middle, the end of the story. I can handle the tone all the way through. I don't have to try and sit down and feel out where the tone is in that place in the book, because tone is pretty constant in something that short. And you know it all. I said this, you do not have to go, when you're writing inside the thing, you don't have to go, has he lost his finger yet? Or is he going to lose his finger a couple of chapters? I better find out if he's, I have to know. And so there's a lot of time in novels where you're actually working back and forth, because when you're working in a small portion of it, you're trying to keep everything together that's happened before, and it's really easy to slip up. And slipping up in that is like slipping up in the mechanics of it. I mean, you make a wrong choice about something. I had a great description. There was a brief time when there were cars with turntables in them. As silly as that sounds, there were cars made with turntables in them. Not very many. It's like when Hostess tried their experiment here in Nova Scotia, where they tried cherry, grape, orange potato chips. If you had a bag of those still, they were literally on the market. They were horrible. The cherry ones were probably the worst. I was like 15. I tried them all, but they were repulsive. And you know why you would do that. But I know an author who was trying to set something in place, and so he said, you know, it was an old car. It had a turntable in it. That's how old it was. And I thought, no cars had turntables. I had to go on the internet to find a car with a turntable in it, right? No, it wasn't the age. It was the fact that, I mean, how do you make the damn thing work without, you know, the moment you hit a bump, you know, you're back to the beginning, you know, unless you got it all weighted down with pennies like we used to when I had the ones from Sears and my records would skip. I would just tape another penny to the top of so it could cut right through the record eventually. So, but yeah, so you have to be careful about that kind of detail anyway. If you have to be careful about tone, and then someone's finger comes back and then goes away again, you know, your reader's going, okay, no, we're not finishing this. And he doesn't even know how many fingers he has. So, yeah, so I like short stories better. But
So when will the novel be out?
should be next fall, if I ever actually get back down into the basement and work on it. Because, well, actually right now we're fighting. We're fighting. My editor and I are fighting, and she's using impossibly evil tools to fight, you know, stuff that you know, no one should be allowed to use in the editing relationship. I phone her up and I say, look, I'm really angry. I'm not going to make this change. This is not happening. She says, the sewer broke in my basement today. I go, but no, I'm ready to fight. Now we're going to fight. She said, well, I have to go. I have a broken sewer pipe. You know, and it's been like that. Every time I've been ready to fight, she has not. She's run away. So, I don't know. I don't know what to do. But she wants to take a lot of detail out of it. She wants to simplify the narrative. And I keep arguing that if you can't occasionally think that this guy's telling you the truth, that's the other problem. It's in first person, and he lies. He lies and lies all the time. You can't, everything he tells you, like he will tell you something, and then 9 pages later, he'll rat himself out. You will discover that he has lied to you again, right? But there are things that you have to kind of believe that he would do or not do. And, you know, if he's evil all the time, that's not going to work. It's got to be finer than that, so we're fighting over that. And
You have to give it a personality.
he has a personality. He's a personality like a black stone in a bag with 9 dead kittens. He's just horrible. Yeah.
How many pages does Walt live in?
90,000 words at the moment, which is just over 300. So, but what?
Stone with all,
Yeah,
the black stone.
just now. Yeah,
Would you be able to just,
yeah.
it's very graphic.
Sorry. I come from I'm not from Newfoundland, but it is a very descriptive culture.
Yes.
So, but, yeah.
So do you think newspapers have too many bad stories in them? Happy stories?
I have to talk to the Canadian Judicial Council on Thursday, and they want me to talk to them about the media and the courts. And what I'm going to say to them is the big problem with media and the courts is that the courts are the one place where people actually have to tell the truth, where you can use everything that's said, nothing is off the record, and there's a story every day. Our newspaper, St. John's, is not a violent city. It's more violent than it used to be. But my newspaper, page 3 and page 4 are court news. and they're violent assaults, and they're, you know, if, well, as they used to say at CBC, if it bleeds, it leads. And the problem is, I think court coverage in newspapers, in my community in particular, is making people think it's a more dangerous world than it actually is. It's actually skewing people's impressions about their own personal safety at this point. Because every day there is horrible news. And, you know, you ask yourself, why do we need that? And as a newspaper, you need it to keep up with the Joneses. You need to sell papers. And there's an expression, an awful expression in the newspaper business called feeding the goat. You can't go to press with nothing on the paper. The goat has to be fed. Every day you have to feed the goat. If you cover court, you will get stories. Some big, some small, but there will always be a story out of court. It will always fill space. So you cover court. It's a given. But it's not great for a lot of things. It's not great for the community. It's not great where it's really, really bad. And we try to cover this off, but it never really works. Where it's really bad is for people who are acquitted of a crime. Because people who are acquitted after court process are guilty in the public's eyes. Because you're there when they're charged, you have them in the paper when they're charged, you have the whole trial in the paper. Now we try to commit that if we put you in the paper, we will cover your trial till the end. And what happens at the end will be in the paper as well. But even if that happens, you have a trial, and the trial goes on for 9 days. You're in the paper for 9 days. You were in the paper when you were charged. You're in the paper when your preliminary hearing is up. And then if you're found not guilty, you're in the paper for a day. And people say, well, he got off on a technicality. You know, he was really guilty. My mom, very pragmatic woman, said, Russell, if you never want to serve on a jury, he says, you only need one sentence. When they ask you about the justice system, you say, police wouldn't have charged him if he wasn't guilty. And you won't ever have to sit on a jury.
Is she right?
I've never sat on a jury. So. It's part of Transcontinental Media, which used to own the Halifax Daily News when there was a Daily News. Used to own the Metro. Owns Cape Breton Post, Charlottetown Guardian, the Prince Albert Herald in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and the Moose Jaw Times Herald. And a whole bunch. And it also owns every weekly newspaper in Quebec. And a good number of the weeklies here, like Amherst, New Glasgow. No, they don't own the Advertiser. No, Transcon doesn't own the Advertiser, which is too bad because it makes a lot of money. Yeah. So, but yeah, I don't think they ended up with the Advertiser. I think the Advertiser ended up with Advocate printing out of Pictou, but I'm not sure. And the Casket is still independently or not owned through that chain too. Did they? Okay. Oh, but.
But no, just this question is still going to the Halifax paper doesn't even have a lot of crime coverage. And in the genre of, you know, if you're feeding masses, it's slightly different than some of these other places.
One of the differences is the Herald is a family-owned paper, and the Herald has the largest newsroom east of Montreal because it has my newsroom has 10 people, 10 reporters in my newsroom, 10 reporters, 5 management editors, 4 photographers, 3 photographers now. The Herald has 70 people. They have an ombudsman. I'd love to have an ombudsman. That would take care of like 90% of the phone calls I get. You know, and I hate the phone. It's like it's a snake waiting to bite me when the phone rings. Because nobody phones the editorial page editor unless they're angry. You know, why isn't in my letter in? Why did you run this story? Those are the two. You know, but if we had an ombudsman, because well, you should speak to our ombudsman. You know. So, but that's one of the reasons why if you have more resources, you don't have to depend on. But I don't know. When I was down here in September, there was an awful lot of coverage of policemen get stabbed in the neck. You know, there was at least 3 days full coverage of that with photographs of the place being searched and not so much of the charges or who was charging, but there was a fair bit of splash. So, Okay, you're free. There will be a test.
Thank you very much, Russell. It's a lovely evening.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you for being so generous and reading the end of the story for us.
Oh, well, I hardly ever get to read the ends of them,
Yeah.
you know. And
I read 5 of your stories, but not one.
well, yeah, actually, I quite like reading, but it's you never know when you're if people get exhausted with readings. You never, it's hard to tell. So, not the readers. The number one problem with people who read is that they go crazy. I'm going to read you the first 35 pages of my novel, and I have another section I'll read after. The best, if you ever get a chance to see Michael Winter, go. Because he won't read. He almost never reads at his readings. He'll fill you in on what he's going to read. He will talk about the circumstances and that he has an uncle who did this. And once I fell in an incinerator and it made me think. And then he'll start to read. He'll read you about a paragraph and he'll go, "Oh, I'm out of time." But he's transporting to here. He's great fun. So if.
Mary Jo had rank him for the reading, it was like that. There was no reading. He was sort of sitting there with his teacup that might have been tea or something else in it.
God, who was it I saw read? It was someone who wrote detective fiction. Famous woman author, and she was in Banff, and she had traveled from Australia with her biographer. God, I should remember her name. But she doesn't travel with her books because they're heavy. So she expects her books will be there, so when she gets ready to read, she'll pick one up from the stack and read it and then put it back at the bookseller's table. But the bookseller was late. And there were 4 of us reading, and they said, we'll let her go last because the books will have arrived. And they didn't. And we got to her, and she stood up, and she said, my book isn't here. She said, so I'll tell you about it. And she told us the whole first chapter. I don't think she missed a word. She was just that good. She just had the whole, the whole reading in her head anyway. And I'm sure she missed some odds and ends, but, it was quite astounding to see. But, yeah.
So we don't have any of Russell's books for you to see tonight because they're actually published by main presses and they're in the main stacks. Special Collections is the small literary presses. I considered bringing Leslie's books out, which we do have.
Well, I was with Cotto first for Our Bad Decisions. But is this mainstream now? Well, they've been sold. My publishing company no longer exists. Thomas Allen has been bought up by Dundurn, so I'm a Dundurn author. No, actually, I'm House of Anansi now.
Your House of Nancy?
Yeah.
Oh, now I can buy you. For Special Collections.
Okay.
All these rules.
Oh, it's
Thank you very
great.
much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks for your time.